I lived in a small, cheap apartment just outside the city. The place was nothing special, just 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a small living room. The main reason I chose it was the affordable rent. My previous roommate had moved out suddenly, and I needed someone quickly to help cover the rent. With limited options, I posted an ad online and hoped to find someone decent. That's how I met Greg. At first, Greg seemed fine. He was quiet, paid his rent on time, and kept to himself. He worked night shifts at a warehouse, so we rarely crossed paths. When we did talk, it was usually about simple things like bills or groceries. But after a few weeks, I started noticing some odd things, small changes that I hadn't really paid attention to before. Every morning, I'd find my stuff slightly out of place. At first, I thought I must have forgotten to close a cabinet or misplaced my keys on the counter. I figured I was just being forgetful and didn't think much of it. One night, I came home late from work. The apartment was dark, and Greg wasn't back yet. I turned on the light, put my keys on the table, and headed toward the fridge to grab something to eat. As I opened the fridge, I noticed Greg's bedroom door was slightly open. This was strange, because Greg always kept his door closed. Always. Curiosity got the best of me, so I walked over and pushed the door open a bit more. The door creaked as it opened wider. I wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe he had left it open by accident before heading to work. But what I saw froze me in place. The room was almost entirely empty. Greg had been living there for over a month, but all he had in his room was a mattress on the floor and a small table with a chair. No personal belongings, no decorations, just bare walls and a dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. I stepped inside and looked around more closely. There were strange scratches on the walls, like claw marks. They were faint but noticeable, crisscrossing the walls as if someone had scraped their nails across the paint. A chill ran through me, and I quickly backed out of the room, closing the door behind me. In the days that followed, the unsettling feeling didn't go away. Greg continued his usual routine, quiet, distant, and only around at night. But now, I couldn't stop thinking about that empty room and those strange marks on the walls. Something just felt wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was soft, as if someone was talking right outside my door. My heart raced as I sat up and tried to listen. The whispering was faint, but I realized it was coming from Greg's room. I tiptoed to the door and pressed my ear against it. The whispering stopped. I held my breath, waiting to hear it again. But there was only silence. I stood there for what felt like ages before finally going back to bed. As I lay down, I wondered if I had just imagined it. A few nights later, I came home and found Greg sitting in the living room, something he almost never did. He was staring at the TV, but it wasn't turned on. The room was dark, with only a faint light from the hallway. I greeted him, but he didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the blank screen, unmoving. I tried to stay calm. "Hey, Greg," I said louder. Still nothing. I slowly backed away, went to my room, and locked the door. That was the first time I genuinely felt afraid of Greg. The next morning, I decided it was time to confront him. I couldn't keep living with this uneasy feeling. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder. Still no response. I hesitated, then slowly turned the knob. His room was empty. The mattress, the table, and the chair were gone. The walls were bare, but the strange scratches were still there, more visible in the daylight. They were deep and jagged. I panicked. Greg had disappeared without a trace. I searched the entire apartment, but it was as if he had never existed. I tried calling his phone, but it was disconnected. I had no idea where he had gone or why he left so suddenly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan in the apartment. Around 3 a.m., I heard the whispering again. This time, it was louder and clearer. It was coming from just outside my door. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, as if someone were standing right outside, muttering in a frantic, urgent tone. I couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking it. I grabbed my phone and called the police. I told them I thought someone was inside the apartment. They arrived quickly and searched the entire place. There was no one, no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone else had been there. But the whispering continued every night, just outside my door. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was all in my head. A A few weeks later, I moved out. I couldn't stay there any longer. Whatever Greg had brought with him, whatever had happened in that room, it wasn't gone, and I wasn't sticking around to find out what it wanted. I was a freshman at the University of Hartford in Connecticut. At first, I decided not to declare a major because I still wasn't sure what I wanted to pursue. I'm a pretty social guy and always wanted to join some kind of group. I applied to rush for a fraternity at school, though I won't mention its name here. The first week was easy. I just had to get to know everyone in the frat and participate in some activities with them. The second week, however, things got more intense. This was when the real challenges began. The first task was chugging 4 cans of beer in under 2 minutes. After finishing, I puked non-stop and was too drunk to stand. It was so embarrassing that the police almost got called because I was causing trouble around others. The second challenge was something no one on earth should ever go through. One evening, after classes, I went straight to the frat house. It was the last day of initiation, and I was hoping to be accepted. When I arrived, I saw a group of members standing there waiting for me. The leader told me, "Follow us," and I went along without asking any questions. We walked somewhere, and I had no idea where we were headed. The further we went, the more I realized that we were going into the woods, and I was right. We stopped at the edge of the forest. I had no idea what they wanted me to do next. My first thought was that they might want me to run around the campus naked. I wasn't too afraid. At least I'd get some cheers. But I was completely wrong. I remember the leader giving me a blindfold, and 2 others tied it around my head. Then I felt myself being placed down on a mat. I couldn't see anything, so I had no idea what they were doing. Next, I felt ropes tying my arms and legs, apparently to some trees. What was happening? Then I heard someone counting down from 5, and when they got to 1, I felt boiling water splashed onto my body. I screamed like a madman. My screams were so loud people miles away could probably hear them. They weren't done. They did it 2 more times, and each time felt hotter and more unbearable. It felt like being thrown into lava. Afterward, I felt them untying me and helping me to my feet. Then they took off my blindfold. I saw all the frat members gathered around, staring at me. I was absolutely terrified at that moment. I thought of running, but there was no way I could outrun any of them, with it being 1 against 20. The leader then stepped forward. He paused for a moment, then extended his hand and said, "Congratulations, you're in." He said it with a smirk. Then he added, "In 2 days, we'll meet up to make it official." And with that, they all walked away. At that moment, I'd had enough. I had no interest in joining the frat after what they'd done to me. Fortunately, I still had my phone and called 911 to tell them everything. They told me to wait there since a car would come to pick me up and take me to the police station to give a full statement. After that, I was taken to the hospital to treat my first-degree burns. Later, I called my mom and told her everything. She was heartbroken on the phone and promised to pick me up right away. When I got home, I had a long talk with my mom and told her that I wanted to drop out this year and return to school next year. She completely agreed. We then reported my story to the school, and believe it or not, the fraternity I had rushed got suspended not long after. This past August, I enrolled in another college, and this time I had no interest in joining any fraternity. My advice to everyone is never to join any fraternity. You have to go through humiliating activities to get in and pay them to call you a friend. It's ironic to call it brotherhood when there's really nothing brotherly about it. It's more like enemies. When I have kids in the future, I'll never let them join any frat after what I went through. In 1960, when I was just 10 years old, I lived in SK, New York. Every Saturday, I had a routine that I looked forward to. My parents gave me a weekly allowance of $2, which felt like a lot to me at the time. On Saturday mornings, I would pack my gym clothes, a towel, and my lunch into my dad's old wool duffel bag. Then I'd cross Albanconk Road to the bus stop. The bus ride to SKC only cost 25 cents, and I was used to taking it every week. Once I got to the YMCA, I'd attend swim lessons for about an hour. Back then, It was a bit embarrassing because we had to swim without wearing any clothes, but at the time, I didn't think too much of it. After the lesson, I would change into my gym clothes and head to the gym. I spent a few hours playing different sports, sometimes basketball, sometimes wrestling, or whatever activity was happening that day. It was always a fun time, and I loved staying active. Before leaving the YMCA, I'd stop by the vending machine to buy a Coke. It cost around 15 to 25 cents, and I'd usually save it to drink later in the afternoon. After grabbing my drink, I would walk up to the town center. SKC had two main movie theaters, Proctor and State. I preferred Proctor because it had a big balcony with a wrought iron railing. I enjoyed sitting up there, even though my view of the screen wasn't always the best from that height. Children's tickets usually ranged from 50 cents to $1, depending on the movie. I'd buy my ticket and head up to the balcony like I always did. The theater was dimly lit, and I found a seat near the railing. I took out the Coke I had bought at the YMCA. I didn't like buying drinks at the theater because they were too expensive, and I always thought the fountain drinks tasted watered down. I settled into my seat and waited for the movie to start. As the lights dimmed further and the previews began, I noticed something strange. A man a few rows behind me was staring directly at me instead of at the screen. At first I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just imagining things. But each time I glanced back, his eyes remained fixed on me. His stare made me feel uneasy, and I began to worry. I tried to focus on the movie, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man didn't seem interested in the movie at all. After what felt like forever, he stood up and moved closer to where I was sitting. My heart started racing. He took the empty seat right next to me, uncomfortably close. I could feel his presence next to me, and it made me feel trapped. I didn't know what to do. I was just a kid, alone in a dark theater with no one to help me. The man leaned in and whispered, asking if I was alone or if I was there with my family. His voice was low, almost too quiet to hear, but his question sent a wave of fear through me. I knew something was off. I didn't answer him. I didn't want to. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of at that moment. I grabbed my dad's old duffel bag, left my coat behind, and bolted out of the theater. I ran as fast as I could, through the lobby and out onto the street. My heart was pounding and my legs felt shaky, but I didn't stop. I kept running, not daring to look back until I was far enough away to feel safe. When I finally stopped, I was out of breath, but relieved to be away from that man. I didn't know what his intentions were, but I knew leaving was the right choice. I didn't go back to the theater that day. Instead, I made my way home, my mind still racing from the encounter. When I got home, I told my family everything that had happened. I described the man staring at me, how he got closer, and how he asked if I was alone. My parents were worried, but also proud that I had trusted my instincts and left when I felt uncomfortable. They told me I did the right thing by running away. That day stuck with me for a long time. It was the first time I had felt real fear because of another person. Even though nothing terrible happened, the possibility that something could have happened haunted me. I never saw that man again, but ever since that day, I've been more careful when going places alone. I always keep an eye on who's around me, and I listen to that inner voice that warns me when something doesn't feel right. Before we dive into the next story, if you're here for the first time, let me know where you're tuning in from. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of the upcoming scary stories. We appreciate your support. Feel free to share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. In late October, my wife Monica and I decided to spend a weekend at the family farmhouse. The place had been in my family for generations, tucked deep in the woods, far from the noise and rush of the city. It was the perfect spot to unwind and breathe in the fresh autumn air. The trees had turned a brilliant orange and red, and the crisp breeze was incredibly refreshing. Our log house felt cozy and rustic, with a quiet charm that always brought peace of mind. That Saturday evening, we decided to relax in the outdoor tub. The warm water steamed up into the cool night air, and above us, the stars were twinkling. It was the kind of night you dream about when you're caught in the city's relentless pace. As we soaked, enjoying the tranquil silence, an odd sound broke the stillness. At first it was just a faint noise, like someone stepping on dry leaves, barely noticeable. I turned my head and listened closely. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, trying not to sound too worried. Monica nodded, her eyes wide. "Yeah, at first I thought it was the wind, but it sounds like footsteps." The noise grew louder, more distinct. It felt like someone was slowly approaching. We sat up in the tub, our hearts pounding. There was no reason for anyone to be out here at this hour, in the middle of the woods. The nearest house was miles away. "We should go inside," I murmured, a wave of unease washing over me. We quickly got out of the tub, wrapped ourselves in towels, and rushed toward the house. My heart was racing as we ran, the cold air biting at our damp skin. Just as we reached the porch, a voice called from behind, "Stop! Police!" I froze in place. Monica did too. We slowly turned around and saw two men in police uniforms stepping out of the shadows, their flashlights aimed directly at us, making it hard to see their faces. My initial reaction was relief. Police meant safety, right? But why were they here so suddenly in the dead of night? "Sorry to startle you," one of the officers said as they approached. "We're investigating some strange activity in the area. Someone reported a police officer visiting this house each night and leaving just before dawn. Do you know anything about that?" Monica and I exchanged confused glances. We hadn't seen anyone here, much less a police officer. This place was always quiet, almost isolated. "No, we haven't seen anyone like that," I replied. "We just arrived here for the weekend. What's this about?" The second officer stepped forward, his face serious. "We believe someone impersonating an officer has been using this farmhouse as a hideout. We've been trying to catch him for weeks." The thought of a stranger lurking around our property while we were away was unsettling. "We'll be watching the area tonight," the first officer assured us. "Lock your doors and call us if you notice anything unusual." With that, the officers turned back toward the woods, their flashlights bobbing as they disappeared. Monica and I hurried inside, locking the door behind us. We didn't say much as we dried off and got ready for bed, but the tension was thick in the air. That night, I found it hard to sleep. Every little sound seemed amplified. Every creak of the old house made my mind race. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I didn't know how long I'd been asleep when a loud, violent banging on the front door jolted me awake. My heart leapt as I sat up in bed. Monica was already awake, eyes wide with fear. "Oh, who's out there?" she whispered. The banging came again, harder this time, rattling the door. I could hear someone outside, their breathing heavy, almost desperate. I swallowed hard and called out, "Who is it?" There was a brief pause, then a gruff, commanding voice answered from outside. "Open the door." My blood ran cold. Something about his tone didn't feel right. The police had told us they were watching the area. Why would they return like this, banging on the door in the middle of the night? Monica clutched my arm, her voice shaking. "Call the real police." My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, my words coming out in a panicked rush. She told me to stay calm and that officers were on their way. Meanwhile, the banging continued. The man outside grew more aggressive, pounding on the door as if trying to break it down. I said, "Open the door. This is the police." I could hear the frustration in his voice, but I knew something was wrong. A few minutes later, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the windows. I peeked outside and saw a squad car pulling up the driveway. Two uniformed officers stepped out, guns drawn. The banging on the door stopped. I heard a commotion outside, and then the real police charged through the front yard, tackling the man pretending to be an officer. Watching through the window, I saw he was a tall, scruffy man in a fake uniform, his face twisted with anger. But there was something else in his expression, a darker, more unhinged look. I shuddered, realizing how close we'd come to letting him in. After the police left, taking the impersonator with them, Monica and I sat in silence, trying to process it all. The farmhouse, once a place of comfort, now felt like a stranger's home. We didn't sleep much that night, and by morning, we decided to leave. That weekend was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but instead, it turned into a nightmare. A memory that still haunts me whenever I think about those footsteps in the woods, the voice outside the door, and how close we came to letting danger inside. My job as a bartender at a small local bar is usually routine, with most days passing by as expected. But every so often, something unexpected happens that leaves me shaken, a dark moment like the one I'm about to tell you about. One afternoon, while I was wiping down the counter, the phone rang. I didn't think much of it, just another part of the job. I picked it up and answered as usual. "Hello, this is Jake at the Roost. How can I help you?" The voice on the other end was rough and direct. "This is Bigby. I'm the sheriff, and I'm looking for a guy named Woody, a big guy, has a beard, usually wears a flannel. Have you seen him?" I tried to picture anyone like that, but nothing came to mind. "Sorry, I don't know anyone by that name," I replied. "Haven't seen anyone who fits that description either." The line went quiet for a moment, long enough for me to think the call was over, but then Bigby's voice came back, firmer. "Are you sure? You're telling me you don't know where he is?" I didn't know where this was going, but I kept my cool. "Nope, haven't seen him. Like I said, I don't know anyone named Woody." His voice suddenly shifted, becoming more intense, almost accusatory. "This is serious, you understand? Harboring a fugitive could get you into deep trouble. You could lose everything." I blinked, feeling my grip on the phone tighten. "Wait a minute, are you accusing me of hiding someone?" I thought. This conversation was getting ridiculous. Who did this guy think he was? But I stayed professional. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about. Is there anything else I can help you with?" Bigby's tone grew impatient, even aggressive. "That doesn't matter right now." That was it for me. I'd had enough. "All right, have a good day," I said, hanging up without waiting for a response. I stood there for a moment, feeling a bit rattled but relieved. I figured that was the end of it, just a strange call from a stressed-out sheriff who had the wrong idea. I went back to work, trying to shake it off, but I barely picked up the rag to wipe down the counter again when the phone rang. I sighed, thinking it was just another customer, but when I picked it up, I didn't even have a chance to speak. "You can't just hang up on me." It was Bigby again, his tone harsher than before. By now, I was getting annoyed. "I can," I replied, trying to keep calm. I didn't need this nonsense, especially during a busy shift. Bigby groaned, and then his voice turned dark, almost unrecognizable. "This is a murder investigation, you hear me? If you don't give me what I need, I'll tear your throat, arm, and face off." Those words hit me hard. I stood there, frozen, the phone pressed to my ear. This wasn't just some sheriff having a bad day. No cop talks like that. It felt like a genuine threat. My heart started pounding in my chest. I had to think fast. Two options came to mind. Either this guy was lying about being a sheriff, or he was a sheriff with serious issues, possibly dangerous. But enough was enough. I wasn't going to let this guy intimidate me. "Listen," I said coldly. "If you've got something to say, come down to the bar and say it in person. But don't ever call here again. If you do, I'll have a friend of mine trace your number. We'll find out who you are, and believe me, you won't like that." With that, I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking with anger and adrenaline. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to calm down. After that, the phone stayed silent. Bigby never called back, and he never showed up at the bar. I didn't know what his game was or what he wanted, but I was glad he was gone. Still, the encounter lingered in my mind. Who was this guy? Was his name even Bigby? Was he actually a sheriff, or just some twisted individual harassing people over the phone? I wondered if he'd done this to others, calling them during their shifts, throwing out threats over the phone. I didn't know his endgame, but something in his voice had sent chills down my spine. He wasn't just someone looking for answers. He sounded genuinely dangerous. And whatever his intentions were, I was thankful I hadn't given him any information. But every now and then, I still think back to that day and wonder, what if Bigby's threats hadn't been empty? What if he really had shown up at the bar? What if he's still out there, pulling the same stunt on someone else? Those thoughts creep up on me sometimes, especially when I'm working a late shift, and the bar is quiet, the phone sitting there in silence, almost waiting. This story takes place in 2019, back when I was still in high school and living in Canada before moving to the United States. That year, I met a girl who I'll call Tess to protect her privacy. Tess and I grew close, and not long after, we started dating. At first, everything went smoothly. We saw each other every day, sharing every moment together. Our relationship was so strong that I even thought about marrying her one day. One Sunday night, we had just finished watching a movie and were walking home together. We chatted and held hands the entire way. When we got to Tessa's house, we said goodbye. I told her I'd see her the next day. She smiled and waved as I left. After that, I booked an Uber and went home. I was really looking forward to seeing Tess the next day. I missed her so much, even a minute apart felt too long. Little did I know that the next day would mark the end of our relationship. The next morning, I woke up, had breakfast, brushed my teeth, got dressed, and rode my bike to school. I didn't check my phone that morning for any messages, calls, or updates on social media. I only checked the time. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I arrived at school about 15 minutes early. 15 minutes later, the first bell rang across the school, and I headed to my first class. I took my seat, and the teacher entered. Just before the lesson began, the alarm went off, signaling an emergency lockdown. This is an emergency lockdown. Strange. What could have happened? I was confused, but followed the lockdown procedure. We all hid in a spot out of sight from the windows, with the lights turned off. 10 minutes later, the principal's voice came over the intercom, saying the lockdown was over and everyone could go back to class. Was this just a drill? If not, why did it only last 10 minutes? Before the teacher could even start the lesson, she read something on her computer, then announced that I needed to go to the principal's office. What had I done wrong? Why was I being called in? Regardless, I had to follow instructions. I went to the principal's office and he asked me to sit down. I was more confused than ever. He looked very serious, and what he said next left me speechless. He told me that my girlfriend had posted a photo on Instagram saying she planned to carry out a school shooting. Someone had seen the post and reported it to him. She had just been arrested and taken into custody. "I'm very sorry about all this," he said. After hearing what he told me, I broke down crying. I had just lost the love of my life. He patted my shoulder and handed me a box of tissues. He asked if there was anything he could do to help. I asked if I could go home for the day to recover from what had just happened. He said I could, and that I'd need to be back at school the next day. I nodded, thanked him, walked out of the office, and rode my bike home. When I got home, I saw that all of Tessa's social media accounts had been deactivated or deleted. All day, I couldn't stop wondering why she would want to do something so horrific, something that could have taken lives. This made me recall a time when I'd asked her about her past, and she'd said she didn't feel comfortable talking about it. I called my parents and poured out everything that was on my mind. They were just as shocked and couldn't believe it either. It was so out of character. I had to finish the rest of my high school days with a lingering fear that something like this could happen again, and the trauma wasn't over. I also started going to therapy every week because this experience took a heavy toll on me. I don't know what happened to Tess after that. She never reached out to me again, and honestly, I'm glad she didn't. It turns out she'd been hiding a deeply troubled side of herself. Wherever Tess is now, I hope she found the help she needed. My name is Camden, and I'm 21 now, but when this happened, I was only 18. I've never been able to completely forget the memory of that night, and I doubt I ever will. My twin sister, Claire, and I were working our usual closing shift at Buffalo Wild Wings, just like any other night. It was a normal shift, nothing out of the ordinary. We were used to the bustling atmosphere, the smell of fried wings, and the sound of sports playing on every TV. When our shift finally ended, Claire and I clocked out, eager to head home and get some rest. It had rained earlier that day, so the streets were still wet and slick. That's something I remember very clearly now, even though at the time it was just a small detail among many. We climbed into my old 1998 Ford Ranger, a reliable but well-worn truck. I pulled out of the parking lot and started the short drive home. It was late, past midnight, and the streets were nearly empty. Everything seemed peaceful. We were only about 10 minutes from home. The first thing I noticed was the silence. There wasn't much traffic, just the sound of rainwater running into the drains and the occasional swish of the windshield wipers. Claire and I weren't talking. We were both probably tired. We'd done this routine hundreds of times, but that night something felt different, though I couldn't put my finger on what. About 10 minutes into our drive, as we neared home, something unexpected happened. The rear tires lost their grip. 1 second, I was driving normally, and the next, the truck was slipping on the wet road. My heart leapt into my throat. I gripped the wheel tightly, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The truck spun out, the tires screeching as they slid across the slick pavement. I can still vividly recall the sound of the tires and the sight of the world spinning around me. The truck crashed into a brick wall. There was a loud impact, and everything seemed to go into slow motion. I heard Claire scream, and then we rolled. The truck flipped twice. There's no way to describe the terror of being upside down, not knowing if or when it would stop. When the truck finally came to a rest, I was dazed but conscious. The air was filled with the smell of gasoline, and I could hear the rain tapping on the dented roof. My first thought was of Claire. I turned to her, panic surging through me. "Claire, are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. She groaned, clearly hurt, but she was alive. For the moment, that was all I needed. I checked myself. I was sore all over, but I didn't feel anything broken. Blood was trickling from a cut on my forehead, but it didn't seem life-threatening. We were incredibly lucky to be alive, and I knew it. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and called 911, doing my best to explain where we were and what had happened. After that, I called our parents, even though I could hardly think straight. It was a blur of panic, fear, and adrenaline. We were taken to the hospital. I had a minor brain bleed and needed stitches. Claire had a concussion. The doctors told us we were extremely lucky to have survived, especially with how severe the crash was. But that's not the part that haunts me. The real fear came later, when Claire and I started to talk about what happened. We were lying in hospital beds across from each other. I asked her if she'd seen what I had just before we hit the wall. "Did you see the headlights right before we crashed into the wall?" I asked, hoping I wasn't imagining things. Claire nodded slowly. "Yeah, I saw them," she said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. A knot formed in my stomach. Those headlights were so close to us, like another car was about to hit us head-on. But there was no car. That's the strange part. After the crash, there was nothing. No car, no sound of tires screeching, just darkness and rain. Where did those headlights come from? I kept replaying it over and over in my mind. If there had been another car, it would have hit us. It was inevitable. Yet somehow, we only hit the wall. When the police arrived, there were no other cars around, and no one mentioned another vehicle. The officer who spoke to us after the crash said we were lucky to be alive. I agreed, but something kept nagging at me. I couldn't stop thinking about those headlights, so close that they should have smashed into us, yet they hadn't. Later, as we were recovering at home, I kept replaying the crash in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was there, something not entirely natural. The crash site was only about 500 feet from a church, and for some reason, that fact stuck with me. It was as if there was an energy at that spot, a presence that had intervened that night. Were those headlights a spirit? An angel? Something else? I don't know, and I probably never will. All I know is that they were there, so close and then gone. Every time I think about it, a cold shiver runs down my spine. That night, I was too close to death, and so was Claire. The part that unsettles me the most is not knowing what saved us. Maybe it was just luck, or maybe it was something beyond my understanding. But whatever it was there. I've lived in Washington Heights, New York City, my whole life. This has always been a rough neighborhood, with store alarms blaring, gunshots going off, and screams echoing down the streets. Those sounds became normal to me. Seeing police cars around felt like just another part of the landscape. But one day, something happened that changed the way I saw my neighborhood, making me realize just how scary Washington Heights could truly be. It was back in 2019. I remember that day clearly because everything started out just like any other. I had just left the barber shop in Midtown Manhattan, heading home. The The subway ride took about 40 minutes, and I got off at my usual stop. From there, it was only a short 5-minute walk to my apartment. I always took the same route, never once thinking of changing it. But that day, for some reason, I decided to take a shortcut through an alley. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, and I have no idea why I did it. The moment I stepped into the alley, a horrible smell hit me. It was foul, like something rotting. I'd never smelled a dead body before, but this was probably as close as I could imagine. My steps slowed as I realized the smell was coming from near a large dumpster up ahead. At first, I couldn't see anything because the dumpster blocked my view. But as I got closer, I saw a sight that made me stop in my tracks. Behind the dumpster, there was a man lying face down on the ground with a knife plunged deep into his back. My whole body froze and my heart began pounding. The man had obviously been stabbed. I stood there, not knowing what to do. My first reaction was to run, but then a voice in my head kept telling me, "Stay calm." I thought about calling the police, but then I worried they might suspect me of being involved. The thought of getting mixed up in this made me shiver. I didn't want any trouble. Without further thought, I turned and ran as fast as I could back home. When I got back to my apartment, I rushed inside, shut the door, and locked it, gasping for air. My heart was still racing in my chest. That night, the image of that man wouldn't leave my mind. His body, the knife, the horrible smell. It was all etched into my memory. But I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't tell anyone, not a single person. If I said anything, people would start asking questions, and I didn't want anyone thinking I had anything to do with it. I also stayed away from the news, both on TV and online. I didn't want to know if anyone found the body or if it was reported anywhere. It felt better to pretend nothing happened, to act like it was just a nightmare. Days passed, and I tried to get back to my normal routine. I kept going to my therapy sessions, something I had been doing for a while, but I couldn't bring myself to mention the man in the alley. Every week I talked about other things, but that dark secret stayed buried inside. I kept telling myself it was safer to keep quiet. When Friday came, nearly a week had passed since I saw that man. I couldn't stop thinking about it. So after school, I decided to go back to the alley. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe police tape, maybe some sign that someone else had seen what I did. But when I got there, the alley was completely clean. The dumpster was still there, but there was no trace of the man or the crime. It was like nothing had ever happened. Even the smell was gone. I stood there, staring at the spot where the man had lain, trying to make sense of it all. Had I imagined it? Had someone quietly cleaned it up without anyone noticing? Even though I had promised myself not to tell, I felt like I had to write this down. I needed to get it off my chest. Keeping it to myself was driving me crazy. Writing felt safer than speaking. At least this way, no one could ask me questions or suspect me of anything. I have no idea what happened to that man. I don't know if he survived, if he was found, or if anyone even reported him missing. Sometimes I wonder if he's still alive somewhere. Maybe even recovered. Other times, I think his body might have been disposed of quietly, with no one remembering him but me. All I know is that since that day, I've avoided that alley. I stick to my usual route, the one I've always taken, and I don't stray from it. Washington Heights is still as loud, rough, and dangerous as ever. But now I see it with different eyes. I know that beneath the surface there are things going on that nobody talks about, and sometimes it's best to keep quiet.